Chapter 52. There was a ferry boat that ran between Civitavecchia and Sardinia, carrying passengers and automobiles. Elizabeth drove aboard in a rental car, lost among a dozen other cars. Airports kept records, but the huge boat was anonymous. Elizabeth was one of 100 passengers crossing over to the island of Sardinia for a holiday. She was sure she could not have been followed, and yet she was filled with an unreasoning fear. Rhys had gone too far to let anything stop him now. She was the only one who could expose him. He would have to get rid of her. When Elizabeth had fled from the building, she had had no idea where she was going. She knew only that she must get out of Zurich and hide somewhere, that she would not be safe until Rhys was caught. Sardinia. It was the first place she thought of. She had rented a small car and had stopped at a phone booth along the auto route to Italy and had tried to call Alec. He was out. She left a message for him to call her in Sardinia. Unable to reach Detective Max Hornung, she left the same message for him. She would be at the villa in Sardinia, but this time she would not be alone. The police would be there to protect her. When the ferry boat landed in Olbia, Elizabeth found that it would not be necessary to go to the police. They were waiting for her in the person of Bruno Campagna, the detective she had met with Chief of Police Ferraro. It had been Campagna who had taken her to look at the jeep following the accident. The detective hurried over to Elizabeth's car and said, "We were beginning to get very worried about you, Mrs. Williams." Elizabeth looked at him surprised. "We received a phone call from Swiss police," Campagna explained, "asking us to keep an eye out for you. We've been covering all the boats and airports." Elizabeth was filled with a feeling of gratitude. Max Hornung. He had gotten her message. Detective Campagna looked at her tired, drawn face. "Would you like me to drive?" "Please," Elizabeth said gratefully. She slid over to the passenger seat, and the tall detective got behind the wheel. "Where would you rather wait, the police station or your villa?" "The villa. If someone could stay with me, I'd rather not be there alone." Campagna nodded reassuringly. "Don't worry. We have orders to keep you well guarded. I'll stay there with you tonight, and we'll have a radio car stationed at the driveway leading to your place. No one will be able to get near you." His confidence was enough to let Elizabeth relax. Detective Campagna drove swiftly and expertly, winding through the little streets of Olbia, heading up the mountain road that led to the Costa Smeralda. Every place they passed reminded her of Rhys. Elizabeth asked, "Has there been any news of my husband?" Detective Campagna gave her a quick, compassionate glance, then turned his eyes back to the road. "He's on the run, but he won't get far. They expect to have him in custody by morning." Elizabeth knew that she could feel a sense of relief, and instead the words brought a terrible aching pain. It was Rhys they were talking about. Rhys, who was being hunted like some animal. He had placed her in this terrible nightmare, and now he was caught up in his own nightmare, fighting for his life, as he had made her fight for hers. And how she had trusted him. How she had believed in his kindness and his gentleness and his love. She shuddered. Detective Campagna asked her, "Are you cold?" "No, I'm fine." She felt feverish. A warm wind seemed to be whistling through the car, setting her nerves on edge. At first she thought it was her imagination until Detective Campagna said, "I'm afraid we're in for a scirocco. It's going to be a busy night." Elizabeth understood what he meant. The scirocco could drive people and animals crazy. The wind blew in from the Sahara, hot and dry and grainy with sand, with a macabre keening sound that had an eerie, unbalancing effect on the nerves. The crime rate always went up during the scirocco, and the judges treated criminals leniently. An hour later, out of the dark, the villa loomed ahead of them. Detective Campagna turned into the driveway, drove into the empty carport and turned off the engine. He walked around to the side of the car and opened Elizabeth's door. "I'd like you to stay right behind me, Mrs. Williams," he said, "just in case." "All right," Elizabeth replied. They moved toward the front door of the darkened villa. Detective Campagna said, "I'm sure he's not here, but we won't take any chances. May I have your key?" Elizabeth handed him the key. He gently edged her to one side of the door, inserted the key, and opened the door, his other hand hovering near his gun. He reached inside and flicked on the light switch, and the hallway was suddenly flooded with brilliant light. "I'd like you to show me the house," Detective Campagna said. "Make sure we cover every room, okay?" "Yes." They started walking through the house, and everywhere they went the huge detective turned the lights on. He looked in all the closets and corners and checked to make sure the windows and doors were locked. There was no one else in the house. When they returned to the living room downstairs, Detective Campagna said, "If you don't mind, I'd like to call headquarters." "Of course," Elizabeth said. She led him into the study. He picked up the telephone and dialed. A moment later he said, "Detective Campagna, we're at the villa. I'll camp here for the night. You can send a cruiser up to park at the foot of the driveway." He listened a moment, then said into the phone, "She's fine, just a little tired. I'll check in later." He replaced the receiver. Elizabeth sank into a chair. She was feeling tense and nervous, but she knew that it was going to be worse tomorrow. Much worse. She would be safe, but Rhys would be either dead or in prison. Somehow, in spite of everything he had done, she could not bear the thought of that. Detective Campagna was studying her, a look of concern on his face. "I could use a cup of tea," he said. "How about you?" She nodded. "I'll make some." She started to rise. "You stay where you are, Mrs. Williams. My wife says I make the best coffee in the world." Elizabeth managed to smile. "Thank you." She sank back gratefully. She had not realized how emotionally drained she felt. Elizabeth admitted to herself that even during the telephone conversation with Alex she had felt that there might be some mistake, some explanation, that Rhys must be innocent. Even while she was fleeing, she had held on to the thought that he could not have done all those terrible things, that he could not have killed her father and then made love to her and tried to kill her. It would take a monster to do those things, and so she had kept the tiny ember of hope flickering in her. It had died when Detective Campagna had said, "He's on the run, but he won't get far. They expected to have him in custody by morning." She could not bear to think about it anymore, but she could think of nothing else. How long had Rhys been planning to take over the company? Probably from the moment he had met that impressionable 15-year-old girl, alone and lonely in a Swiss boarding school. That was when he must have first decided how he was going to outwit Sam through his daughter. How easy it had been for him. The dinner at Maxim's and the long friendly talks during the years, and the charm, oh, the incredible charm. He had been patient. He had waited until she had become a woman. And the greatest irony of all was that Rhys did not even have to woo her. She had wooed him. How he must have laughed at her. He and Helene. Elizabeth wondered whether they were in it together, and she wondered where Rhys was now, and whether the police would kill him when they caught him. She began to weep uncontrollably. "Mrs. Williams!" Detective Campagna was standing over her, holding out a cup of coffee. "Drink this," he said. "You'll feel better." I'm sorry," Elizabeth apologized. "I don't usually carry on this way." He said to her gently, "I think you're doing molto bene." Elizabeth took a sip of the hot coffee. He had put something in it. She looked up at him, and he grinned. "I decided a shot of scotch wouldn't do you any harm." He sat down across from her in a companionable silence. She was grateful for his company. She could never have stayed here alone. Not until she had knew what had happened to Rhys. Not until she knew whether he was dead or alive. She finished her coffee. Detective Campagna looked at his watch. "The patrol car should be here any minute. There will be 2 men in it on guard duty all night. I'll stay downstairs. I suggest you go up to bed now and try to get some sleep." Elizabeth shivered. "I couldn't sleep." But even as she said it, her body was filled with an enormous lassitude. The long drive and the tremendous strain she had been under for so long were finally taking their toll. "Maybe I'll just lie down for a bit," she said. She found it difficult to get the words out. Elizabeth lay in her bed, fighting against sleep. Somehow it did not seem fair that she should be asleep while Rhys was being hunted. She visualized him being shot down on some cold, dark street, and she shuddered. She tried to keep her eyes open, but they were heavy weights, and the instant they closed she began to feel herself sinking down, down, into a soft cushion of nothingness. Some time later she was awakened by the screams.